All right. So I can't believe it, but we're already starting week 4. And this week, the thing that we're going to be talking about is suffering, something that those in the helping professions know quite a lot about. And certainly, I'm sure that you all have stories that you could tell about suffering. But before we get to that, and the opportunities that you might have either in your reflection or in the threaded discussion, I want to talk to you a little bit about some things having to do with suffering from a theological perspective, especially from a biblical perspective. But before we even get to the Bible, I want to talk about the Buddha. Siddhartha Gautama, 6th century BC in India. It is this man who was a prince of an area in India, modern day India, that we know as Siddhartha Gautama. His father was a king, he was a prince, he wanted for nothing. And in fact, so the story goes, he was about 10 or 11 the first time he actually left the palace, and he had not been allowed to see any kind of suffering, anything that would maybe traumatize, probably our word, not theirs, right? But traumatize him in any way, shape, or form. But when he is about 10 or 11, he does leave the palace, and one of the things that he discovers is an old man who is suffering. And this begins, Siddhartha Gautama, again, later known as the Buddha, begins him on a path of discovery. And one of the things that he discovers, and I think it resonates with really a lot of religious traditions, I think there are many points of contact between this idea and what we see in Christianity, which is, of course, my religious tradition, is that suffering happens everywhere. The world is full of suffering. And then the Buddha goes on and reflects about that. So there's that initial experience when he's 10 or 11, and then as he leaves his father's household and becomes a monk, and then achieves, so the tradition goes, achieves enlightenment. This idea of suffering is kind of the linchpin that holds everything together, that life is suffering. And that one fact kind of caused the Buddha to head out on this, again, on this path of discovery having to do with suffering, and then what you do about that. So it's one thing to say that life is suffering, but it's another thing to say, well, we've got to do something about that. It's hard to imagine that the Buddha at 10 or 11 hadn't experienced some kind of pain, right? We run as little guys, we fall down, there's pain. We have a new tooth that comes in, or we lose a tooth, or we have a headache or something like that. By the time you get to 10 or 11, you've experienced these things. So it's interesting, especially when we're talking about a healthcare context, as we are right now, but it's interesting to think about what suffering is. And as we go along in the talks for this week, and then the reflection that I want you to do, this idea of defining suffering is going to be really, really important. And I'm not really sure that you will define it the same way that I do. Here's a question. Here's kind of an operating question for me. Is pain or is disease, right? Are those two things, are they suffering? Now, one could say that if one is in pain, and certainly it might depend on the degree of the pain, right? But if one is in pain, we commonly talk about pain and suffering, right? We think of the two going together, but do they? So that's kind of a question that I want you to be thinking about as we go through the next few minutes together. Are pain and suffering, are they the same thing, or are they different things? Now, I'm going to telegraph what I think. And you are free, absolutely free, as you know already, I think, to disagree with me. I don't think pain and suffering, or disease and suffering, are the same things. I think they're different things. I think that pain, it maybe it's related, it's cognate, it can cause suffering. Disease can cause suffering, but is it suffering? And I don't think it is. I think suffering is something different. I think suffering is something emotional. I think it is psychological. I think it is those things. Now, I'm not saying it's not related to the physical realm. I'm not saying that at all. I'm not a Platonic thinker that separates the real, out there, the heavenly or the esoteric, the non-physical as being real, and then what goes on in this life as being, with the physical body, that's immaterial, that it is unreal in some ways, right? I don't think that way. I think much more kind of holistically. But in the interplay, I think you can kind of dissect them, if you will, right? I think you can say this is pain and this is disease, but suffering, that enters into a little bit different kind of category. And if you think about the Johnston article that some of you have read already, maybe there's something to that. Maybe Johnston sees something that is important in that realm, and that might be a nice application of what Johnston is doing. So again, that's what I think about pain and what I think about suffering, that they can be divided or dissected in some way, and as a result, then when it comes to suffering, it's very possible that the suffering that people experience is not physical. It might be psychological suffering, a suffering that I might not share at the time, or suffering might be temporal, right? It might be related to a certain experience at a certain time, maybe the loss of a loved one, or anxiety or fear, or those kinds of things. So I want to go through this week's lectures, just holding that in the back of our minds. Now, what are we going to do this week? Well, with the next lecture, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about Job 1 and 2. So if you have a copy of the Bible, if not, just read it online, right? I'd like for you to read the kind of the beginning story of the book of Job. What happens to him? I'm going to talk about Job 1 and 2. In fact, the article you'll read for this week deals with Job 1 and 2, also in relation to this tsunami that took place in India in 2004, I believe it was. Then we're going to talk about Luke 4:18, one passage in the Gospel of Luke. We'll go from there, we'll go backwards to Isaiah 61, which is what Jesus actually reads and quotes in Luke 4:18. Then we'll move forward to Acts 10:38. And again, one verse in the book of Acts that I think would be helpful for us to consider as we think about this suffering thing, right? And then I'll talk about and give some more explicit directions about this week's reflection. Now, I've been very flexible about reflections. I like for students to be able to go where they want to go with those things. This week, I want to be a little bit more specific, and I think some of the feedback I'm getting is that students want me to be a little bit more specific as well. So I'll start giving you some guiding questions that may help you kind of hone in on something. The first couple of weeks, as we've been kind of getting to know one another and just letting the talks take you where you wanted to go, that's totally cool, and I love that kind of thing. But this week, we are going to talk about some specific prompts that I'd like for you to address. Okay? So, Job 1 and 2 is next.